Hey everyone, it's Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action Podcast, back with another article review. In today's episode, I want to look at the role of expectations for success on skill acquisition, right? Whether you believe you're going to succeed or not. And kind of an interesting new twist on this, looking at how those affect performance under pressure. So, what we're talking about here, of course, is Gabby Wolf and Rebecca Luthwaite's optimal model, right? So, this is the paper we're going to look at. This new paper by Simmons and colleagues. Yeah, what we're talking about is the optimal model. The idea that is that skill acquisition is enhanced with external focus, with autonomy, and with enhanced expectancies, right? So, skill acquisition is better. You acquire skill better when you have higher expectations for success, right? Is their idea. And what how they've shown this, of course, is most famously with the studies with the illusion, right? So if you create an illusion where a golf hole looks bigger than it really is, that increases people's expectations for getting it in. They learn a skill better as compared to when they train under condition where it looks smaller, even though the actual hole is exactly the same size, right? So your expectations for success are changing. When they're tested in retention with no illusion, just a regular golf hole, the people that had the perceived illusion of the bigger hole do better, right? That's the basic idea. There's some discrepancy in more recent studies about that finding. We'll get to that. This kind of idea is always kind of not sat well with me because it conflicts with some other things. So what I want to do at the end, after I talk about the specific study, is to put an ecological spin on all of this. So that's where I'm headed today. Okay, so that's the idea. So enhanced expectancies improves outcomes. What this paper wants to do is dig a little bit deeper and try to understand why. And one of the proposed explanations of why this works, right? So if you're have greater expectations that you're going to succeed in a task when you're learning it, right? It's going to be less likely that you're going to do hypothesis testing in Rich Masters terms, right? You're going to try out different things. It's going to be less likely you're going to focus internally on your mechanics and trying to find a movement solution that works because you're expecting to succeed, right? So the idea is that one of the reasons that enhanced expectancy help performance and skill acquisition is they lead to more of an external automatic mode of control. Like you're controlling things automatically when you're not thinking about your movements and trying to adjust things to do better because you are doing that. You think you're doing well, right? So it leads to less reinvestment, less focus on your body, less internal focus, more automatic processes, right? So this obviously is a information processing based explanation. That's what this paper is going to test. Uh, these explanations that enhanced expectancies lead to more automatic external mode of control, right? That's the basic idea, right? And I should put up front, right? I've talked a lot about how I kind of switched things out in my career. I contributed a lot of this to a lot of this work, testing the information processing ideas of a link between attention and pressure, right? And that's what this is going to really test. Okay, so enhanced expectancy more likely cause learner to uh, so we have a move more automatically controlled. Okay, reduced expectancies if we make you think that you're not going to succeed, right? You're going to try to correct things. You're going to try to change techniques. You're going to search for a new movement solution, which will make you internal. That's the basic idea of what they're going to test, right? So what they're going to do is use two different, they're going to do the basic paradigm of building up enhanced expectancies or lower expectancies, and they're going to test two different transfer conditions. One is under stress or pressure created by having you in a cohort you have to compete against and making you think you're doing poorly. And another one is a dual task, so um, where you have to listen to sounds and pick out a sound. And they make really interesting predictions, right? So the traditional information processing explanation of what happens with pressure, right? And you can kind of map it onto ecological. This is a figure from my book I called the creeping hand of pressure, right? So you're performing in golf, you're performing a skill, self-organization, external focus, you're letting things equally, you could say automatic. In the last round, the pressure gets up, you try to control your movements from the top down, you break everything apart, right? So one of the explanations, the information, basic information processing explanation for why people fail under pressure is it disrupts automaticity, right? It turns your attention inwards. You start caring more about what the consequences. So you think about your movements, think about where your hands are, how fast you're moving, and it disrupts your skill. Okay. So so what we so that what we'd expect, right, is that's under stress. Okay. um the the So what they're testing here is how these two things affect each other, right? So they're the so when they're learning the skill, and the other one they tested was a dual task, right? The sound. So those are kind of they're going to look at how these two different things affect, right? I think I have this backwards here. So what they're predicting is that under stress, enhanced learning under enhanced expectancies should hurt you, right? Because you're making the skill very automatic. Pressure is thought to break apart an automatic skill. Okay. Um, in a dual task where you have to listen for a sound, I think I've written this backwards here, so ignore that. The When you're listening for a sound, reduced expectancies should help you, right? Because under reduced expectancies, you're focusing on the internal movements. You're going to have less resources available, more resources available for the dual task. Okay, so that's a basic idea. Okay. So what they did in the study, they had a dart throwing task under enhanced or good expectancies provided by feedback. They'll show it's a dart throwing task. So then they would do a transfer to a dual tone counting in a stressful situation involving false social. So you're competing against all the people in the study. They tell you when they're in their lower third. Okay, right. So that's a basic design. And I'll go back over the prediction in a second. Okay, so it's predicted to be better performance and retention for those enhanced compared to reduced. So the basic skill acquisition after we train, we train and we just test your performance after in a retention, you should be better under enhanced expectancies as predicted by optimal theory. However, there'll be better transfer to the dual task, but poorer transfer under stress when enhanced compared to, okay? So let me say this again. So in the dual task, right, you're listening for a tone. If your skill is automatic, which enhanced expectations help, that leaves more resources to listen for the sound, so you should do better. In stress, if your skill is automatic, that is going to increase the chance it breaks down under pressure. So reduced expectations should help in this situation. So that's their basic predictions. So they had 36 participants, 18 males and 18 females. They were randomly allocated to three groups: enhanced expectancies, reduced expectancies, and a control group. I mentioned they used a dart throwing task. So they had a standard dartboard. So your task was to throw at the bullseye. Okay. But on the dartboard were two concentric circles around the bullseye. One was relatively small, and one was big. Okay. And that's how they manipulated expectations, right? So, um, and these were adapted from pilot data, getting so they capture most people's throws. So the idea is in the enhanced expectation group, what they're going to do is they're going to tell you anything inside the big circle is a good trial, right? So they're giving you essentially a bigger target to hit, right? And they're going to give you feedback. That was a good trial. That's a success. Whereas in the reduced expectations, they're going to tell you that only things inside the smaller circle around the bullseye are good trial, right? So they're going to give you um, essentially feedback that you're not doing as well, which is going to lower your expectations. That's the basic idea. So they're instructed anything in a large circle will be good. Anything landing with a small circle would be good for the reduced expectancy. They were given good verbal feedback. The control group, they were told nothing about, they're not given any additional structure about those other circles. They were just told to hit the bullseye, right? They weren't given any other feedback. So that's how we create these expectations by essentially manipulating the size of the target around the bullseye. And if you land in it, you're going to give a good trial. Okay. After that training on day 2, they did a retention test. So retention test in this and all the so they what you do in a retention test, you train. So you're training under these expectancy conditions. We're going to take those two circles away and just have you throw at the bullseye. And what Wolf and colleagues have essentially found is you're better at just the task of throwing bullseye when you train under those enhanced expectancies. Um, so that was the first thing he did, this retention test to test whether skill acquisition is better under enhanced expectancies, to repeat that effect. Then they went to the two dual task conditions. The dual task, they're presented with 3 tones. They had to say the word tone every time they heard the high one, right? The stress condition, as I mentioned, what happened? They were put in a group. They were told they were matched. They were competing against everybody in the study, and they were given the fault. No matter how well they were doing, they were told they were in the bottom third, right? So they weren't doing very well. So it's a combination of social comparative threat and negative performance feedback, right? So I think I've talked about this before in my pressure. What we found is, so any time where you're comparing and people are judging you and things like that's the thing that really causes choking under pressure. That's what really causes us to turn inwards. They use self-efficacy levels to see if people's expectations and confidence went up, and did a measure of stress. Okay, so that's the basic design of this study. Okay, what did they find? What did they find? So this is that they looked at. First, they looked at a manipulation check of self-efficacy, how confident you are that you'll be able to perform tasks. And not surprisingly, they found the enhanced expectation, the group that were trained with the big circle, had higher self-efficacy, higher confidence. They were good at the task than the reduced expectancy, which was lower than the control group. Okay, so they got the manipulation seemed to work. Okay, so that's the first finding. The second thing, when they looked at the dual task, so this is the performance in the dual task, right? So how many percent correct did you get in identifying the high pitched tone? What they found was that the enhanced expectancy group was highest in this. They got the highest performance, and reduced expectancy was no different than the control group. This is consistent with the idea that enhanced expectancies make you learn a task. You develop automaticity in the task quicker. You have more attentional resources available to do that dual task, right? That's you have to listen for the sound. So that's consistent with their proposal. Okay. The next thing they did was to look at the other. So this is a performance as a function of block. Okay. The first thing you see is, so this is at retention. So after we train you, we take all those circles away and we test again. They did not replicate the basic wolf finding in this study, right? So they did not find that people that train under enhanced expectancies were better than those reduced expect. There was no significant group difference at all, right? So they did not replicate that basic effect. So the evidence that enhanced expectations enhance skill acquisition. Now, if we look at the dual task, we just look at performance on the secondary task of picking up the tone. This is performance in dart throwing. What they found was, paradoxically, the reduced expectancy group performed better under the dual task than they perform worse. Sorry, under the dual task, that's more higher is worse here. They perform worse under the dual task than the group that did enhanced expectancies. Right, this is what you expect. Enhanced expectancies, automatic, more resources available to listen for the sound. So you have more. The dart throwing is going to be better too. Okay, but this is where it gets really under stress, right? The enhanced expectancy group did the worst, right? The reduced expectancy group did the best and was no different than the control group, but there was a significantly worse for the enhanced expectancy group. Develop automaticity, break it apart with pressure. That's the basic explanation. Okay. I should point out before I go on too farther, there's been more, as I said, more recent studies, and here's one I reviewed before, have not quite replicated this expectancy effect, right? The idea that when you train with enhanced expectancies, you get better retention, you learn the skill better, right? It has not been replicated consistently. So I'm going to get back to that in a second, why I think that is the case. Okay. So they think enhanced expectancy leads to a more automatic mode of control, limited attentional resources. So you have more resources available to do a dual task, but at the same time, this increases your chance you're going to break down under stress, right? So the results are kind of consistent with the information processing based explanation of the effects of pressure, the effects of dual tasks, right? So that's the basic finding of this study, which I think is interesting, right? Interesting finding. But what I want to try to do to end here is try to put an ecological spin on all this. As I said, I contributed to a lot of this development of this theory and testing of it. So this is a real flip flop for me, but I think we can explain it equally well in ecological approach. So let's try to do this. Okay. Can we explain the results in ecological approach? Okay. So first of all, let's look at the basic task, right? So When you put a big ring or a small ring around the dartboard and tell me it's a good trial if I land inside it, you're manipulating a task constraint, right? You're manipulating a task constraint that say basically the size of the target for a successful trial, right? If I have a large ring, right? If my target is large, that's a task constraint that's going to encourage the person to stabilize their existing solution, right? If I keep throwing a dart and it lands in and you tell me that was good, right? I don't have a lot of incentive to search for another solution, right? Where I'm going to accept this is good enough, right? So I'm probably going to be, if we're talking about kind of Newell's stages of learning, and be the exploitation phase. I'm going to try to stabilize that attractor, make my solution solid, because my movement solution is going to work pretty much right from the start. But it's not likely going to be a very effective solution for hitting the bullseye, right? Because what it's going to be is kind of a sub. It's going to be a local minimum. It's going to work to put it in the big circle, but if once I get to a task of hitting the the dart the bullseye, I wouldn't expect it to be that effective, right? Because I need to be in. If I'm kind of satisficing this of just getting it in the big. Okay. The small ring, right? It's a task constraint of a smaller target to hit. This is going to encourage me to search for a more effective movement solution, right? Most of my trials I throw, I'm going to miss, which are not successful, right? So my movement solution is not going to work. I got to find a better one. So I'm going to explore, and so I'm going to be less stable. But if I keep doing that, I'm likely going to find a better solution because I'm right. I'm aiming at a smaller target. I'm going to be challenged to get a higher level. I'm not going to be able to just satisfy with this local minimum, right? And this is a reason I've always had a problem with this enhanced expectancy, because it goes against the challenge point, right? So a big circle and a small circle, challenge is going up when we reduce the size of the circle, right? So enhanced expectancies are essentially giving people a really low level of challenge, right? So it's kind of like, okay, I'm going to teach you how to serve a tennis ball. If I told you that that was a good serve anytime it landed anywhere on the other side of the net, versus I told you it was a good serve if it landed in the service box, right? Which one's going to lead you to be more effective, a better solution, right? The challenge point hypothesis says the service box, right? We got to challenge the person, right? Maybe right when they start, we want to just others get it over the net, but as they prove, we want to challenge them at the right optimal level to encourage them to find a more effective solution, right? If we just give them a really easy goal, right, of getting it inside the big ring or just getting it over the net, once, right, that's not going to challenge them and push them, right? So the expectancy explanation seems to fly in the face of the challenge point hypothesis, right? It's to me. So what I think, the reason I think we're getting some inconsistency in the expectancy results. So whether or not enhanced expectancy results in better performance at retention, right? Sometimes we get this when sometimes we don't. I think it really is going to depend on the number of trials, right? um, for a very short number of trials, you're going to be better at finding in the enhanced expectancy one, because you've kind of found a solution right away and you've stabilized it, even though it might not be the best one, right? You've settled onto something, right? So I think in a low number of trials, you're stable. Whereas in the small ring condition, even though it's challenging you more, if we only do a relatively small number of trials, right, that's going to make you're going to be very unstable, right? You're searching for a solution. You're searching for a better solution. So if I test you, then you're probably going to struggle a little bit. But if I give you enough trials to find a better solution and stabilize it, then in the end, you're probably going to be better in the reduced expectancy condition, right? So that's kind of what I think is going on in this. Okay. Um, Performance under pressure. So what's going on under pressure? Okay. So what I think, kind of my new view of a performance under pressure, is that performance under pressure is essentially changing the perceived task constraints for the person, right? When we are under pressure, and particularly in this one, also because they're using false feedback, they're telling you you're in the bottom third when you're not. Okay. So what you're doing is essentially it's like under pressure, you're putting an even smaller ring around the bullseye, right? You think that you have to achieve even more accuracy than you did before, right? That's typically what happens to people under pressure, right? They think they have to elevate their game and perform at a higher level, right? Um, so they have this higher demands, right? So if under enhanced expectancy you've settled on this local minimum that's not very good, now I have these super high demands, I'm going to struggle, right? Whereas if I started with reduced expectations, I'm searching for a better solution, I'm probably going to be able to handle this kind of increased demand. So that's why I think you find that reduced expectations lead to better performance under stress. Okay. So the solution that emerges in the enhanced expectancy is not likely to satisfy these new perceived task demands under pressure. So it's going to be very unstable. You're going to have to start exploring again, right? Better performance for reduced where search for a better solution is encouraged, right? So that's why I think you get these effects. That's why they got these effects, right? You're changing the perceived task demands. Okay. Dual tasks. So what about the dual task condition? Dual task conditions are, even though I've encouraged people to use them and I think that, there's some merits to them. They're really hard to explain. They're not hard to explain in ecological approach. I think we think about them very differently, right? In the information processing, we think we can directly compare a single task of throwing darts with a dual task, right? All we've done is added on something, right, that's going to take more of your attention or resources, right? I think in ecological approach, a dual task is a fundamentally different task than the single task, right? Right. We've changed the information that's relevant for your task, the specifying information, right? When we add a task of listening for a sound, right? Now, not only do you have to use visual information and proprioceptive information for the dart throwing task, now you have to auditory information, right? So it is relevant to your task, right? So we've completely changed the task. So it's in a complex nonlinear system that's likely to lead to a completely different solution than one where we just throwing darts, right? Because the information has changed. So I don't think they're very comparable. I don't think that we can compare them in the way that would in the information processing view. But the idea, I would think that the reason you get better dual tasks, you perform better in the dual task condition is, right, when you add this other task where you have new information and new dimension to the task, having a fairly stable solution for the dart throwing component of it, the movement, is probably going to benefit you initially, right? Maybe you can search for something completely different that satisfies both and those things like that. But I think enhanced expectancy, which leads to a more stable solution, is going to be initially better. Right. So those are my kind of takes on ecological explanation of the enhanced expectancy and the effective pressure, and how I would describe them. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Thanks for joining me. Cheers for now and keep them coupled.